Hello my friends, and welcome to a bit of a new type of video. I decided a couple weeks back that I wanted to basically read some books about video games, see what other people in publishing, in scholarship, have to say about the topic of video games, rather than just evaluating games by myself or watching other YouTubers evaluate it in the same somewhat grassroots method that I think most of us approach the media with as fans, but not necessarily as people involved with the business or involved with design. And I decided that the first book I wanted to read, if this new idea, is Console Wars, because probably it's the book that has gotten the most media attention in terms of a book about video games, and makes itself more accessible to the non-gaming public by being about video game history and the sort of business wheelings and dealings that go on inside the industry, or at least went on inside the industry through the tumultuous time of the 80s through the mid-90s. So I picked it up from my local library. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that a lot of my books on my list about, books about video games are actually at my local library, which is kind of remarkable because I no longer live in a big city and I don't live in a college town. So finding very specific niche hobby books, I call that niche even though the gaming isn't really niche anymore. It's just that books about gaming are still fairly rare. No one really writes about video games, so it's kind of a treasure hunt every time I am able to find one of the books I'm actually looking for. So I took a few notes. I have an outline next to me here, and I'm going to go through some of the more interesting parts I found in each of the different chapters and the story as a whole. And the first bit that I want to get to... Oh, and first, apologies for the lighting not being super great. I was trying to catch the good morning light, and I'm afraid I just missed it. So I'm going to be partly in shadow, partly lit up. However it turns out in the future, this is what we have for today. And I guess my first impression of this book, going through the first few chapters, and it definitely did manage to meet its promises of being very consumable, despite being about a niche industry and about being about business in a niche industry. And it centers mainly around the personality Kalinske, who became the head of Sega of America during this late 80s, 90s era, where Sega was really challenging Nintendo, trying to make Nintendo not hold basically 100% of the video game market, and resulted in the infamous Console Wars, hence the name of the book. And I found that Kalinsky's story, the narrative of being someone who had reached the top of an industry only to be undercut by other people around him, and basically struggling with the idea of, and struggling with feelings of being a failure, despite having done so much to achieve in his past, however much effort he had put in, however many accomplishments he had made in the past, still finding himself in that place of feeling like a failure because he essentially got completely ousted from what had been his success previously. And I found that really relatable because, though not nearly to that extent, my own experience of having to move out of schools and into real life with the job market and how harsh and basically still continuing to be harsh, unable to, really struggling still to find a steady career, having basically what I would describe as complete success in schooling, hasn't quite translated for me out in the real world, which is a bit unfortunate, don't you think? The next bit, I believe, was in chapter 5. I get back to it. Probably would be easier if I started from the front, if I'm only going to chapter 5. The History of Nintendo of America. It had a specific section describing a person named San Borofsky, a marketing and sales associate firm that worked with Nintendo, that basically established Nintendo's overall corporate policy of essentially intentional scarcity with their product. And that's something that we've been seeing continue on with Nintendo for their entire duration of being a company, at least in the United States, where I guess the most recent examples are particularly the Amiibo sales, though those aren't timely anymore because Amiibo's pretty much past statement at this point. People often talked about how Amiibo were so hard to find, and there were plenty of rumors about Nintendo purposefully keeping Amiibo scarce so as to drive up demand. And a lot of people wanted to put those rumors aside because what benefit would Nintendo have to not put out tons of product and make tons of money in the moment when they can? And that's a really American-style capitalist way of thinking, whereas Nintendo, even Nintendo of America, has always taken more of a tact of we would rather be slow and steady, we would rather hit the goal rather than extremely exceed the goal right now, and do it in a way where we know we can hit the goal next time as well. And if that means intentional scarcity, Nintendo has been happy both in the past and in the present to make that happen. And it was enlightening to see that not only is it a rumor, but it is confirmed fact. It was the philosophy of one of the very early influencing marketing and sales associate firms that Nintendo worked with. Moving on, in chapter 8, titled Birth of an Icon, we're going back to the creation of Sonic the Hedgehog, and the fact that the backstory for Sonic that was being discussed during his development was that he was a Nebraskan, which means Sonic and I are kin. We're both Cornhuskers, which means I have to like him. We gotta support our own. I was never really a big old fan of Sonic. I loved the Sonic Adventure games as a kid, but I wasn't so into the character because I felt like it got really cringy to be a Sonic fan, and maybe it still is a little cringy to be a Sonic fan, but I mean, now I gotta support him, because we're both Cornhuskers. I'm going to jump ahead a lot though, because in chapter 18, and I'm trying to describe the interesting points that I found in a way that doesn't really spoil the enjoyment of reading the book. I'm not trying to give a replacement to the experience of reading the book. I'm just trying to pull out some interesting tidbits and facts and my thoughts on them. But the Underdog Days of Summer, chapter 18, or section 7 of chapter 18 specifically. Let me go find that. It was somewhere in here. Right, week 7, I believe, maybe 8. Right, so on week 7, they titled this subsection of the chapter Sonic Boom, which I just reviled. It was just reviling to me. I audibly said, fuck you. Censor that in post, Alex. I audibly said to the very idea of calling this section Sonic Boom, when Sonic Boom was releasing around the same time as the publishing of this book, and the content of that chapter was about Sonic's media tie-ins that were being used to promote the game, and the result from that is that we have another media tie-in in this book promoting the new Sonic property in a section of the book talking about Sonic having media tie-ins to promote the original Sonic property. And that is like an unnecessary degree of meta for the sake of marketing, and I don't like it. I didn't like it. It's stupid. But it did make me laugh, so I guess mission accomplished. It's memorable. But at this point, I'm not going back to play Sonic Boom games, and I'm not going to go back to watch the Sonic Boom cartoon, though admittedly the first few episodes I kind of was okay with, even though it did feel remarkably stupid as someone who had liked what the Sonic characters were before. So in chapter 19, I found Enemy of My Enemy. I found it largely interesting that Nintendo was essentially responsible for the invention of one of the earliest point-of-sale systems. And that is interesting to me, not because I'm a geek about retail. I mean, God forbid, retail is one of the worst industries to have to work in. But that it kind of proves, or at least it's some evidence to one of the arguments that I've been making with people for a very long time, which is that video games push technology and industry throughout the society. It's not just, better and better gaming consoles, but the fact that gaming as a hobby demands the highest fidelity, the best performance, the bigger and better of everything it can get out of technology in a really incessant pace, that it shows that with the creation of a point-of-sale system, video games push technological advancement in other industries as well, sort of pushing everyone forward. And so, in terms of social benefit, social equity to video games, it spreads far beyond just the experience of a hobby, but into the realm of making lasting and, drastic change to people's general convenience or the kind of technology they engage with in their day-to-day life. The next chapter where I found something interesting to talk about was chapter 27, called Something Beyond, just because it got into the issue of video games being blamed for violence, and we haven't even yet reached the point where Mortal Kombat is coming into the picture in terms of the history books, but it shows a lot of how we are still facing the reality of politicians and NRA lobbyists and any other person who is somewhat tangentially related to an industry that makes its money to some degree off of violence, or at least tools for violence, and their constant use of video games as a red herring. And something I want to point out is that it was a harder fight back then, but now we have even more research, and it's basically a settled issue. It's already proven that video games do not have a significant correlation nor any degree of causation with violence, but it's still going to be used because video games are the most recent technological advancement in terms of entertainment media. Now, you'll also see people blame smartphones for whatever and whatever social problem, and that's just the nature of the previous generation having to accept or engage with new technology that is embraced by the next generation. Even Socrates criticized the written word for crippling people's ability to use long-term memory. And at this point, we consider writing to be one of the most archaic versions of media that we could use. We still value it, but the people who are saying writing is so good for you don't realize that the generations before writing said that writing would be the doom of the human race, the destruction of our intelligence, and all these other things that are levied against any new technology. So it's kind of an issue of just having to deal with the reality of this, and there's a chance that video games might be the last entertainment media that gets blamed for this, because I don't really see how media that can engage with the senses of smell or taste, which we don't have yet, could come to replace video games as a media or take on a new entertainment media of their own. So I kind of think that video games might be the last great innovation in terms of entertainment media, which means it will always have the target on its back for these claims of, violence or destroying life until perhaps every generation just gets so accustomed to them that people stop trying to use that line of argument. But overall, the chapter more highlighted the positive aspects of change that the video game industry can have on the world, and a sentiment that I've seen continually echoed just from all of the charitable efforts I see from creators on YouTube and Twitch and blogs and more, and how gamers in general, as people just trying to present themselves and the hobby in a good way to show the good that it can do, are actively trying to be as charitable and as beneficial to other people. And I don't think they're doing it out of threat or duress, because I don't think video games as a medium are actually in any sort of danger, but it's because they feel it's the right thing to do. And so let's see, moving on though, chapter 30, called Just Do It, was very interesting to me because there was a lot of discussion about the growing relationship between Sega and Sony in the early 90s, at least Sega of America and Sony America, and how they were trying to be cooperative because they were trying to still take that market share away from the powerhouse of Nintendo, trying to, form some stability for themselves in order to take on the big guy. And it makes me think about now, where Nintendo has fallen behind due to the abysmal launch of the Wii U, and Microsoft being fairly successful but underperforming with Xbox One than what they had projected. PlayStation 4 largely is the market leader, and we're seeing Nintendo and Microsoft play well together now, and creating things like network crossplay and all these other benefits, and trying to paint PlayStation as not being good for players and not playing ball. But the only reason that Nintendo and Microsoft are cooperating is because they're not the market leader. When Nintendo was the market leader, they were extremely conservative, kept everything in-house, and did not cooperate. And the only reason they're having a change of heart is because they're trying to be like Sega and Sony were in the 90s, trying to get their share back, trying to be better competing in the market. So I don't think we as consumers should really see, oh, Nintendo and Microsoft are playing well together and doing what's right for us. We should be seeing, oh, competition is what's doing right for us, because we're making companies fight against each other, not fight against us. Don't have monopolies, my friends. Monopolies are bad. Let's see. I had a number of things that I wrote down, but I didn't find them to be too terribly something I want to focus on. On chapter 36, we had Prometheus. I am lisping all over the place. Chapter 36, Prometheus Revisited. I have to say that people playing the Sega CD on Sony's Jumbotron in New York City, 1992, the year I was born, could very well have been the very first public Let's Play. I don't know what the internet's official first Let's Play is, but I think on a giant screen in New York Square, you know what I mean, is probably going to count. Had lots of viewership, I'm guessing, big numbers, but no ad revenue. Maybe that's the final say on whether or not something is officially a Let's Play, if YouTube lets you monetize. Let's see. In chapter 42, the chapter called Barbarians at the Gate, we're talking about moving into 3D consoles. In other words, moving out of the Genesis, out of the Super Nintendo, and on to the N64, and anything that comes after, the PlayStation 1. And I found it really interesting because it made me think about sort of the state of VR, because they listed a bunch of different early competing consoles that failed during this period. And we're kind of in that same position with virtual reality as a platform, in that we have a lot of different virtual reality providers. We have the Vive, the Oculus, PlayStation VR, Android face mounts, Nintendo's Labo face mount, and even walking through Best Buy, I've seen Android devices or Android-like devices that are supposed to be, completely contained virtual reality experiences, whose name I completely forget the moment I leave the store. And I just can't help but think that we're either going to see PlayStation VR become the norm for virtual reality because it's so much more affordable and convenient, and can coincide with a more traditional gaming experience, or I'm wondering if virtual reality will split off into its own standalone experience itself, because right now non-PlayStation VR really relies on the fact that you have a computer that can handle that kind of experience, the kind of technological burden it places on processing. And having a PlayStation console versus a laptop or a actual gaming computer, the gaming computer is usually going to run you significantly more than the console, so the barrier to entry for VR has been pretty high, except for PlayStation. And it makes me wonder if virtual reality is going to try to become a standalone thing, or if it's going to be eternally tied to the console, eternally tied to at least one of the console providers, even if it's not PlayStation. See, moving on. In chapter 44, Crazy Like a Fox, I was very interested in a person named Tony Harmon's manifesto, where he basically wrote up criteria for what makes a great game in order to appeal to Nintendo of Japan to let him attempt to make a video game that would prove that non-Japanese people can make great games too, to a group of very wealthy and nationalistic businessmen on the Nintendo of Japan side, who really, in a bigoted way, did not think anyone outside of Japan, anyone who wasn't Japanese, would be able to make a really good game. At this time, Microsoft and other non-Japanese game makers weren't really creating the biggest hits at this point. However, what confused me about that specific bit was that the game developer Rare was the one that ended up being the studio that worked with this funding that Harmon was able to procure due to his very well written and impassioned plea. But Rare had already entered the scene as a European developer and had already earned clout with Nintendo as someone who could make really high quality games for their platform. And it sort of makes me wonder, why did Harmon's manifesto need to exist at all if the counterproof was a already established studio that had earned Nintendo's trust as, look, a non-Japanese studio that can make great games that matches Nintendo's sensibilities. But But I guess maybe that was just being played up for dramatic irony. Uh, I had another thing to say about the issue of violence in games, particularly with the legal battles that surrounded the release of Mortal Kombat, Senator Lieberman, um, and the court hearings that resulted after. It was a really intense moment in the book, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading through it. And a lot of people, they like to give Nintendo a pass for anything that they are slow to pick up in the industry, negatives about their consoles or about their games. People almost never want to discuss because Nintendo has this sort of this family-friendly nostalgia, pocket that if you say anything negative about Nintendo, you're just a hater because you're trying to attack people's childhoods. And I think people are a little too soon to forget that Nintendo, family-friendly Nintendo, really resisted the idea of having ratings for games, having a publicly, a public rating board, and that during these trials that would have created a government-run rating and censorship board like the FCC, but for video games, it essentially would have crippled the industry. Basically told people they could not make games the way they want to make games, or at least making certain kinds of games would become either highly censored or highly illegal. And Nintendo was happy to push for that reality in order to throw Sega under the bus, in order to get back their market share and be the top competitor, to be the hegemon of video games again. And whereas Nintendo as an industry isn't really that anymore, they were that back then. And we have to remember that Nintendo almost sold out the entire industry just to be number one. And in terms of should we see Nintendo as the infallible nostalgia machine, no, I don't think so. They do make great games, but there are also a lot of bad games on Nintendo consoles, and there are a lot of bad business practices with any corporation. And to not scrutinize them because we feel good about them, that's irresponsible. It's also kind of naive. But moving on, they did eventually get their act together right after the hearing ended, and played ball to create the ESRB in the following year, 1994, 1995, I forget which one. But thank God for Arthur Pauber, who was the one who actually got these companies to play nice to each other rather than bickering like children, because I like video games, and it would have sucked to be in a world where all video games were regulated by the government. So let's see, we're nearing the end here. Chapter 62, Fork in the Road, was sort of presenting Sony entering the console market, being hugely successful, and the way it was described, their overall market strategy of focusing on Europe, where consoles really hadn't hit their major stride the way they had in the United States, kind of made me see that Sony had been very quietly learning all of the lessons of Nintendo's more steady business practices with Sega's very aggressive marketing campaign, resulting in really a large paradigm shift for the industry, something that would really solidify itself later on with the release of Final Fantasy VII, but that was kind of out of the purview of the topic of the book itself, so it's not something that we didn't really quite get to anything Final Fantasy or Sony related. They were just there as the background character to let us know that the new age was coming, the new dawn was dawning. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. It was extremely exciting in the beginning. Admittedly, excuse me. Admittedly, as it went on, uh, it really started to drag, and that became kind of unfortunate because, and I guess it sort of accurately reflected the reality of what Kalinsky and other players in the industry were thinking about their positions and how things had changed once they were no longer fighting for every inch of land they could get, but just maintaining a general day-to-day business, run the status quo sort of affair. And to go from an arc of this was really exciting, followed by now everyone's just bickering like children over the legal stuff, and throwing in all of these interrelated facts like baseball team purchases and movies that are related to the story but not really related to gaming or the struggles of the gaming industry, and then pittering out as the industry having moved on from these players that sort of made it, that got it to that point that it was at. I found it to be it got harder to finish because it wasn't as interesting. The climax of the story, of the historical story, happened long before the story was over, which is accurate to history, not so good for fiction, but then again, it's a non-fiction book. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really think anyone should, who is interested in learning about the gaming industry or finding some place to start about literature on and about video games, could definitely start with Console Wars. And you know, I found it at my local library, so there's no reason you can't find it at yours, probably. Other than that, buying it online is certainly not impossible for most people that's going to be watching this video, because we live in internet times. So, thank you so much for watching this very impromptu book review. I don't know if this is going to become a series. I do have a lot of other books that I want to be reading. I don't know which one I'm going to do next, but I do know that my library does have more of the books on my list. So hopefully within some decently recent amount of time, I'll be able to get the next one out. But until then, my friends, thank you again. Do all the YouTube things, hit the like and subscribe and notification bells at the bottom so that you don't miss anything that we make or we release. This community, still very small, but we can grow with your help. And if there's anything that you particularly liked about the book, if you read it, please by all means share it in the comments, or anything else you'd like to talk about. And as always, stay true.